Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is your wonderful teacher, Mr. Knudsen, and I just wanted to narrate through and do a little bit of activity with icing quotes. And the good news is you learned from this Markulier in language arts how to take a quote and introduce it, cite it, and explain it in your writing. And we're going to do the same thing here, so we're not going to spend tons of time on it, but we are going to look at it slightly differently. When we do it in this class, right now, we're thinking as a journalist. So we have to think about ice quoting as we would as a journalist would in their story. So, hold on, and here we go. If we didn't get a chance to talk about plagiarism in class, plagiarism is really the idea that you take something from someone and you don't give them credit. And in this particular case, we're talking about quotes or paraphrases. If you take the exact words of an author, you are taking that author's ideas and their words. That's what plagiarism is. And then you put it into your own writing, and then you pass it off as if it was your own work. On the other hand, if you're paraphrasing and you're not using the exact words of the author, but you're using the same ideas the author is providing, you are also still plagiarizing because you're stealing that author's ideas and passing it off on your own. And plagiarism is the highest crime in academics. Like they're in school, cheating, the highest form of cheating is plagiarism. When you take others' ideas or others' words and you pass them off as your own, that is bad. So, it is bad for a couple of reasons. One, you're basically stealing somebody's property. We call it intellectual property or property they're lying. You're taking it, and then you're giving yourself credit for it. Credit you didn't deserve. These aren't ideas you came up with, and you shouldn't do that. In journalism, if a journalist is caught plagiarizing, they get into a lot of trouble because they are not allowed to simply take information and pass it off as their own. Furthermore, journalists wouldn't want to do it because, in all reality, a journalist is reporting on the news, and they want to report what other people saw and what other people observed. And so that creates a sense of credibility for the journalist. So a journalist really doesn't want to steal ideas either. And the easiest way to avoid it is if you're borrowing ideas or if you're borrowing words of another person, you give them credit. That's the easiest way to avoid it. And so we're going to talk about, for this mini lesson, basically just quoting. We'll talk about paraphrasing later. But we're talking about how do you avoid plagiarism and create a sense of credibility in your investigative news report that you are working on. So today is really all about avoiding plagiarism in your investigative news story by citing your sources using what is called a borrowed information sandwich. As you learned in language arts, it really looks like icing the quotes that you use from others or others' writing. So we're going to go through some of the notes and then get a little class practice, and then you're going to take this and continue researching, and you're going to continue writing. Remember, for Monday, you have to have a 600 to 1,100 word printed, double-spaced draft. All right. Now we're going to talk about icing. And really, you've already seen this in language arts. Whenever you're going to use a quote, and quotes are awesome, they're great, they give different perspectives in journalism, we want to use them. We want to make sure we introduce the quote. We want to make sure we cite it. And then sometimes we're going to make sure we explain the quote. And unlike in language arts, we might not always explain the quote in journalism because we're using the quote to say something, to paint a specific vivid detail, or to talk about illusion, and maybe an explanation is not needed. And in journalism, less words is more. So, you want to explain a quote anytime it doesn't directly relate and enhance what you said previous to it. But if it's already been said, you don't need to say it again. So really, it's this idea that when you take somebody else's words and their ideas with their words, you want to then use the words, and then you want to explain it if it's not completely apparent. So really, the I stands for introduce the information, and I'm sure this is very similar to what language arts and what you've done with Miss Marcoulier. You want to set the context for the quote. Tell the reader where the information came from. So you see a few examples. The Animal Humane Society retorted. Pulitzer Prize-winning critic Roger Ebert argues, according to West's Encyclopedia of American Law. And you see some more examples and some words you can use instead of said. You can think of words other than said. I know that they say said is dead in 6th grade. Well, the truth is, in journalism, said isn't dead. And sometimes said is exactly what you want to use. So again, remember, it's about deepening the reader's understanding. And so you want to introduce the quote. You want to say who said it and why we should care. Because if you just say, Joe Tonzik said all Syrian refugees should remain in Europe. Joe's a nice kid. We all like Joe. But that isn't really, to somebody who lives in Texas reading this article, they don't know who Joe Tonzik is. So what you need to do is say something like, according to Joe Tonzik, professor at Harvard University of U.S. history, or something, so that you give who said it, but also why it matters to the reader. How does that help the reader understand? And remember, it helps build credibility. So when you say who said it and why we should listen to that person, it helps build credibility for you as the reader, for you as the writer, and for your audience when they're reading your story. So all sorts of different ways you can introduce your quote. The key is you say who said it and why they are important to the reader to understand that they said it. Again, we need to know that it's somebody who we should pay attention to. When we get on later into our position paper, you're going to see that this becomes even more important. But really, a journalist wants to focus on why are we choosing to quote that person as opposed to someone else. Okay, now we're to the citing of the information. You want to make sure you include the quote or the part of the quote you want. And if you're going to take the whole quote, what you are doing is you're seeing the words and you are going word for word, letter for letter, the way the author did it. So if I went to find a news story on Donald Trump and I found one about his presidency, and I say there are many ways in which Donald Trump could lead the nation. And hopefully the way they spelt nation was wrong. Because as you look, there's a slight misspelling there. The point is you take it word for word. And in actuality, if they misspelt it in your source, you would also misspell it in your source, because you're going, quote, word for word, letter for letter. And then there would be a period in the quotes if there wasn't a need for in-text citation. We'll talk about that next week. But that's the part you know. Most people can go out, find a quote, and then take that quote word for word and put it in their own writing. Again, you would use the quote to help you build your reader's understanding of the topic. Now, sometimes there might be an occasion where you want just part of the quote. So, for example, you don't want the whole quote because it really doesn't fit into your works. You just want part of the quote. And so if you just want part of the quote, what you will do is you will use an ellipsis. That's the 3-dot thingy. And you probably didn't talk about that in language arts, but if you did, it's a good review. The 3 dots, or an ellipsis, is the tool that allows you to take parts out of the quote. So if you see, as you can see down here, what you see is a ellipsis bullies. So that means that sentence has some stuff before it that you didn't want. And then after bullies is another ellipsis. And that means there's stuff in between there that was there that you just wanted to get rid of. because you wanted the part of the sentence that said goalies can't continue to be allowed to goalie. And then there's some stuff after that. So the ellipsis is a really great tool when you, especially a journalist, they will use them a lot because they don't want everything the person said, and they don't even want the whole sentence because they have word limits they're working under. They will take just a snippet of the quote, or they'll take 3 parts of the quote and then, put them together into one. Now, here's the thing I have to warn you about. When it comes to ellipses, that's the plural of ellipsis. If you use ellipses, you must stay true to the author's original intent. So you cannot ellipsis out like the word not, and then it says like do your taxes, and then you ellipsis out the word not. Like that changes the quote's meaning to the complete opposite. So when using an ellipsis, it's a great tool for taking part of the quote out that doesn't really fit into your writing, but it's not permission for you to make it seem like somebody said something they didn't actually say. Now, not on the slide is another thing you can do. Once in a while, you want to add a word or two in, or maybe you want to change the quote to past tense, so you just want to add ed to the verb to make it past tense. That's the only thing you're really doing. If you need to add something in, you use brackets. Note that I did not say parentheses. You use brackets, and that will allow you to insert information. If there is a point in your paper where you want to insert information into a quote, you should probably come talk to me so that we can make sure you do it right. But I see students do it once in a while because the way the quote's written, it doesn't fit unless you have to add like a phrase or you add a different verb. So you can certainly do that. You could probably YouTube how to insert words into a quote, or you could just come talk to me. But you can insert into a quote, and that's the cite part of icing. Finally, we get to explain the quote. And then it's basically saying you explain how the quote helps the statement how the quote helps explain what you are trying to explain. Now, remember, in journalism, unlike other places where you take a quote, the quote might be self-explanatory, meaning you don't have to say, this means that, this shows that, this proves that. You might not have to say that in journalism because you're using a quote that you've already decided deepens the reader's understanding, so you may or may not explain the quote. The point is, you do need some explanation sentences after quotes, especially if you've had to subtract from them or add to them, or if the quote is written in a way that isn't quite the words you would have used, you might need to explain after the quote. And here you've got an example. According to West's Encyclopedia of American Law, an individual is guilty if he or she is responsible for a delinquency or a criminal or civil offense. There's an in-text citation. We'll talk about that next week. In other words, legal guilt is tied to the laws of the country, not one's own personal beliefs about what is right or wrong. That helps us understand that the previous quote where it says individual is guilty if he or she is responsible for delinquency of a civil offense, civil meaning government or civics or citizen. So this red text really just shows you an explanation of what that quote means. Generally, if you use it in journalism, it's because the quote was somewhat complicated, or you really want to put it in other words that a layman, that's what we call somebody who isn't an expert, can understand. All right, so when you explain a quote in journalism, you're doing it because the quote itself is not clear enough, and the reader needs something else to help them understand. So I just wanted to give you a few explanatory phrases or some ways to explain the quote. I won't read them all to you, but you can see the page in front of you, and I'm going to give you a second to read it. That was actually 10 seconds. I can tell it's timing. All right, explanatory phrases. These are different ways you can explain the quote to others. And it helps just to see some of the ways you can explain it, because later on we're going to talk about transitions. And when we talk about transitions, what you will find is some of these that you see in front of you are actually also help the reader transition. And that's an area that we need to continue to work to get better at. So, in front of you, you can look at these and you can refer back to this presentation whenever you need to for some ways to explain the. So now is really work time for you in class. And I want to say this again in a different way so you can understand. All that we talked about yesterday, when we talked about the context of your story, answering the 5 W's about the context of your story, not just about your story. So remember, the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, how, why, applied to not only the anecdote or the first portion of your story, the story that illustrates your investigative news report, but we're going to spend some time answering the 5 W's of your angle and issue. And so quotes are a great tool to help you answer the 5 W's both of your anecdote story and of the story that explains how your narrative story or anecdotal story starts. I do say you must have at least 2 quote sandwiches using ice. So you might have more quotes than that, but in your story you need to have at least 2, where you introduce your quote, you cite your quote, and you may or may not explain your quote. Okay, so remember that in journalism you sometimes do explain a quote, oftentimes you don't because it's self-explanatory. So for Monday, I'm going to remind you this little part where it says must have lead completed. That is inaccurate. Remember, it's what I told you in class yesterday. You must have a printed 600 to 1,100 word investigative news report that contains your story that starts, the story that illustrates your issue, plus kind of like a transition paragraph or transition information. And then you're going to answer the 5 W's of the context of your issue. The who, what, when, where, how, why of land erosion, or the who, what, when, where, how, why of why cyberbullying affects teens, or the who, what, when, where, how, why of how poverty is, the day in the life of the person who lives in poverty is very difficult. So that's what you need for Monday. If you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand. You can watch this video again. That's a good use of your time. You can continue researching. That's a good use of your time. You can continue drafting because it's due Monday. That's a good use of your time. You could start keeping track of your sources and putting them on a page and starting to look at that. That's a good use of your time. You could work on inserting quotes into your story because you have to have at least 2. That's a great use of your time. Asking your friend what they're doing for the weekend, not so much a good use of your time. All right? So thank you very much for listening, and you may now get to work. You can grab the laptops. You can work on your iPad. The point is that you use this time wisely because come Monday, we're working on some new stuff. Thank you. Good luck.